Well, good morning. My name is Connor. It's good to be here with you this morning. I am the pastor of Church Expansion, and you may be asking yourself, what in the world does that mean? And that's okay, because I oversee our online campus. Shout out to my online crew. What is up? I'm so glad you're here with us this morning. And I get to partake in all things digital strategy here at Hope City. And you may hear that and be like, that sounds super lame. But here's what I've found, all right? It is one of the coolest jobs ever because I get to see God take the kingdom further and faster than ever. And here's what we've watched. Here in a few weeks, we're gonna release some numbers and some different things that God has been up to. But one of the exciting things is that our message on a weekly basis is going out to over 45 countries, which is amazing. And so I get to help make sure that happens, and I get to help with hosting the online campus and doing all kinds of cool stuff. But one of the things I love most is seeing the different people that we get to engage that maybe would never step foot in a church. And I need your help with that. So one of the things, I don't often get to be up here with you guys. I'm usually behind a screen, but I want to encourage you. Would you do me a favor? Would you partner with us on our online campus by sharing the Facebook feed or the YouTube link each week? Right now, if you want to take out your phone, you can. I won't hold it against you, I promise. But share that feed on your page, because here's what it does. It gets the feed in front of people that I'm not connected to and I may never meet. And it gets it in front of people that may never step foot in the doors of a church, or let alone Missouri, right? And so it's an exciting and easy way for you to get the good news of what's happening here at Hope City and in the kingdom out in front of others. And we ask our online crew to do that every week. And so, I want to encourage you to do that as well. It also means that I get to hang with our church plant down in Northwest Arkansas. And can I tell you, that dream started around a fireplace a couple years ago. It started with Cody and I and a couple others sitting around a table dreaming about what God was going to do when we were only about a year old, and us dreaming about how cool it would be for one day God to plant a church in Northwest Arkansas called Hope City. And so to get to go down there every couple weeks and get to hang with their team and get to hear all the ways in which God is orchestrating a story so much bigger than we could ever ask or imagine, it's just amazing. Friends, would you promise that you would continue to pray for Adam and Gabe and the team down in Northwest Arkansas? Because I don't know if you know this or not, but they started planting a church in the middle of a pandemic. Kind of crazy. But man, it has been so cool to see the ways in which God has opened doors and moved so that the kingdom could be established in new and unique ways. Because let's be honest, God's been in Northwest Arkansas for a long time. And we get to partner with what he's already at work doing. And I'm excited for Adam and I'm excited for Gabe and all the people that are a part of that story and the journey that's just beginning. I'm excited because I remember where we were 7 years ago. I remember standing right here in a pile of dirt and watching trees burn before this building ever came to be. And I'm excited because I can't wait to see what happens in Northwest Arkansas. And in 5 years, the things that we're going to be saying and the dreams that will have come to fruition. And so I'm excited also because it reminds me of where we've been, right? And this summer series and Joshua. And today we're going to be in Joshua 11. So if you want to turn there, you can. And we'll dive in here in a moment. But that's where we're going to be today. And I get to continue our series. And the first 4 weeks, Cody really did a great job setting us up and helping us understand that all of Joshua is about one step of faithfulness after another, right? That everywhere we turn, it's about one more step of faithfulness, one more step of faithfulness. And I love it because it reminds me of where we're at as a church. And just saying, yes, God, all right, we'll continue to follow. And we're going to take one more step of faithfulness. And this leads to another step and another step. And it's just incredible to see all that God has done. And last week we got to hear from Charlie, and he preached about the story of Achan and this idea that maybe God's people didn't get to enter the promised land because there was undealt with sin in the camp, right? That had to be sorted out for them to be able to fully step into what God had for them. And I'm excited because today we pick up the story at yet another battle, another obstacle. And you may hear that and be like, man, Israel can't catch a break. Like everywhere they turn, there's another battle to be fought, another wall to be torn down, there's another obstacle. What is happening? I don't know about you, but I've felt like Israel before in my life. I felt like, man, I just can't catch a break right now. I feel like around every turn there's some surprise, and I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop, and there's just always something happening. You see, I think there's two things happening in the store, or that happen in life, right, when it comes to these types of situations. Sometimes I think we're just too sensitive, and we need to put our head down and just keep working and not worry about what's going on around us. And then there are times where we experience like real heartache and real life and real like hurt, and we need to know like, man, what does God do in the midst of those moments? And the good news for us is today, the story that we're going to be in is about those real life hurts. It's about what God does in the midst of the moments where we feel like we've experienced injustice or we didn't get what we deserve rightfully. This is where we pick up the story with Israel in chapter 11. This may sound silly, but I don't think I could have ever made it in the desert as Israel, right? And maybe you're with me. Maybe you've heard the story of Israel in the desert, and you know right now, like before I even get into it, like, nope, I'm with you. I would have never made it in Israel or in the desert because I'm not an outdoorsy person, whatever your reasoning might be. I feel like I'm pretty decent at being outdoors. Like I could figure it out. That's not the reason. The reason is this, and this sounds silly, I know, but I've told you this before. I love food, all right? And I would have had a really hard time in the desert, like relying on God for my meals and only getting what was like enough, because let's be honest, I like to eat a little bit more than enough, right? Because that's how I roll. But I was thinking about this as I wrote this sermon, right? And I was trying to figure out like, man, how do I experience chapter 11 in my own life? And then it came to me because I was at a drive-through, right? And I ordered a few tacos, one to three tacos, and then 2 burritos, and then maybe some nachos. You may be thinking, is he ordering for a whole family? No, it's just for me. But here's the deal. I was ordering all this food because I like to eat, and I was very excited. And then I get home, I look in the bag, guess what? Only 1 taco, not 3. Only 1 burrito, not 2. And I got my nachos, but let me be honest. The first thing that came to my mind when I didn't have all my food is I have to go back and burn that restaurant down. I have to do it. Rage. I don't know about you, but that is like the most infuriating thing in the world, because now here's what happens, right? You all have done this, and you're gonna feel this, all right? Now you have to do the drive of shame. Now you got to drive back what feels like 30 miles, which really is 3 minutes, to Taco Bell. And then you got to figure out, am I going to go in and be that guy who goes up to the counter and is like, hey, you guys didn't give me all my food? Am I going to call and be like, I need to talk to the boss. I just came through. Or am I just going to get back in the drive-thru and have to wait in that line again? There's no way I'm waiting in that line, right? If I get this frustrated about Taco Bell, there's no way I could have been faithful to God in the desert, I promise. I would have been out 14 days in, be like, I need more food. I'm hungry. But I love it because it reminded me that this is all too close to home, right? That we feel, even in the little ways, these injustices. And what happens is when I experience an injustice, my response is, well, I then need to protect myself. I need to take care of myself. I need to go get what's rightfully mine. And so when somebody cuts me off in traffic, what do? Well, you better believe I catch up to them. I cut them back off, let them know, power move, I'm back. Somebody says something bad about me at work, right? Or at the gym, what do? I maybe say something behind their back to hurt their credibility and make people doubt their character, right? And I don't think about that, but that's what happens, right? And I go, oh man, I found myself talking bad about somebody that I love or I care about because I feel like I was wronged or they said something or did something. Again, sometimes I'm too sensitive and I need to put my head down and work harder, and I need to just forget all the things going on around me. And then there are other times where I experience real life hurt and heartache. A bad health diagnosis, the loss of a job, our car finally died. We don't have the money to fix it, right? There are these things, these life stresses that end up making us feel like we're backed into a corner and we have to fight for ourselves, yet we never see that in Scripture. And today, the passage that we're going to be in speaks directly to the moments in which we experience real injustice in our lives, where we have been wronged, where we have been hurt, where we are in the waiting because we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what's next. Not only in the bad, but in the unknown of what's around the corner. This is where we pick up the story in chapter 11, and I'm excited because I believe it is so applicable to us today. Let's check out what chapter 11 says in Joshua. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Axphath, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, in the Nepoth Dor on the west. To the Canaanites in the east and the west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah, they came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made a camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Let's pause right there, because if you're anything like me, you're thinking, who did what with where? That's a lot of names, a lot of kingdoms that are hard to pronounce, and we're only getting started, all right? So I want to pause because as I read this, I'll be honest, I was trying to figure out, man, what is God doing? Like, why list all these names? Why get into the details of the kingdoms and the chariots and the horses and the cities and all of the stuff? By now, you should be able to tell that a battle's coming, right? Like if you didn't know, another battle on the frontier getting ready to happen, and it's going to be a big one. All of the kings begin to hear about what's happening in the south, right? All these, in chapter 10, which we didn't discuss, there's all of these battles happening in the southern region of the Promised Land, and Israel finds like victory in those. And Jericho has fallen, and there's all of these things that are happening, and the kings begin to figure out, like, oh, like, Israel's no joke, and, like, God is coming with a vengeance, and so, like, we better, like, get together and, like, stop this thing. And so this is what's happening, right? Like, all of these cities and all of these kings are named because the author wants us to understand that what is made up in the north is the rest of the Promised Land. The yet to be defeated, those still standing an obstacle to God's people, stepping fully into what God had for them, right? And so this is all of the land, and I love it because it goes on to say that we're told in great detail that the kingdoms come together and that there are chariots and horses, and like we need to understand that like what's getting ready to happen is no joke. Why include all the names of all the people and the battle and the fact that there will be horses and chariots, as many as there is sand on the seashore? Because the author wants us to understand the gravity of what's getting ready to take place, that this is not some small thing that you do on a Saturday afternoon. Like we're getting ready for war. And what's about to happen is no small feat. It's the seriousness of what's ahead. And then we see this in verse 6. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them slain over to Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." We'll pause again because I love, this is where the story hinges, right? It hinges on this moment because it's not about the power of Israel, it's about the power of God. And this idea that God is going to show up for the Israelites in the battle, like he has at Jericho, like he has time and time again in all of the southern battles. But what's different about this moment, and I don't want you to miss this, is that when these words are spoken, Joshua would have thought back instantly to what was said to Moses and taught to the Israelites in Deuteronomy 1:21, where it says this: "See, the Lord your God has given you the land. Go up, take possession of it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, told you. Do not be afraid and do not be discouraged." Here's why this is important, because in Deuteronomy 1, there's this moment where Israel comes out of the desert, and they're going to enter into the Promised Land, and they are met by these giants. And the response by the Israelite spies is fear, and they run. They want nothing to do with the giants. Like, they are big cats, and they go back to Moses, and they're like, there's no way, we're not going to the Promised Land, not right now, not never, like, not happening. And so this is where we pick up the story. It's important that we understand that in this moment, 40 years later, we are standing at the same place with the same people, and we're going to get to see what happens with Israel as they reconvene with the giants that once stood in their way. So let's take a look at verse 7 and see how the Israelites respond. So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth, Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all of these kingdoms. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. And they burned Hazor itself. Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds except Hazor, which Joshua burned. The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities, but all the people they put to the sword until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, as the Lord commanded his servant Moses. So Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua took his entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills, from the Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, to Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and put them to death. Joshua waged war against all of these kings for a long time. Let's pause right there. The first couple times that I read this passage, I missed this last part. Again, there's a lot of kingdoms and there's a lot of war language, and we're going to get to the war language here in a moment because I had to try to figure out what to do with all of that. But before we get there and continue on the list of cities and names, we'll jump back in directly where we left off. But there's a couple of things I don't want you to miss before we go any further. The first one is that at the end of that passage in verse 18, it says that Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. And here's what it taught me as I studied this, that sometimes when God is fighting battles alongside us and on our behalf, he doesn't show up when we want him to or when we think he should. It takes longer sometimes than we would have hoped. And in the midst of the battle, sometimes it's so hard to see whether or not we are victorious until the smoke clears and we can see the victory. But don't forget that God is fighting. You see, in my head, I thought of this battle when I first read this, and I heard it, I don't know, for whatever reason, I thought of it as this like movie scene, right? And we've all watched movies where there's wars and battles being fought, and I think that affects the way that we view war and battle. It makes it feel like it's a way shorter period of time than it actually is. But usually wars and battles take a very long time, right? And we know that, but I think watching so many movies, you're like, oh yeah, like God stepped in, it was just like really cool moment, and he just like wiped everybody out, and like a day later, the war was over. That's not what happens. It's a long battle, and in the midst of that battle, God was fighting, and I have to wonder, like, what were Joshua and the Israelites thinking? Like, they must have got into that battle and been like, God, are you sure you're fighting with us? Like, we're losing some people. Like, what is happening? This didn't look, I thought, like, you would just, like, snap your fingers and this would be over. This doesn't look the way we thought it would. And it's a reminder that God is fighting on our behalf, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it doesn't happen according to my timeline or my plan or my will, that God is at work. And he is fighting. Don't forget that. What we also see in this passage is the sufficiency of the Lord was especially on display. Here's why. Because Israel's victory over the giants of Canaan, the Anakim, 40 years earlier, these very giants stood in the way of God's people stepping into the promised land. Here's what you need to know. Those giants once refused the land, and now Israel meets them again. And guess what? The giants didn't shrink. They didn't get any smaller. Israel comes and meets them once again, and the difference was that the new Israelites believed that God was greater than the giants. And hear this, the same God who was sufficient for Israel in the desert and in the waiting and at Jericho is equally sufficient for his people, for you and I today. He wants to meet us in the midst of the darkest and hardest moments of our battles, yet sometimes it feels like nobody's there. I just wanted to pause so that we would not miss this moment, right? And again, understand that Joshua fully gets and wants us to get that the same giants that stood in the way of Israel are now being defeated as Israel steps into the promised land. This is an insane moment, right? This is the final boss moment of a video game, right? Like, this is a big deal. So let's jump back in. Verse 19 says this. Except for the Hivites living in the Gibeon, not one city made a treaty of peace with the Israelites. Don't forget that. Make note of that. Who took them all in battle? For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel so that he might destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory, only in Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, and did any survive. Let's pause right there again. I don't know about you, but I would not want to be Joshua. I would not want to follow in the footsteps of Moses, right? Like the guy who led Israel out of Egypt, who split the Red Sea, who did all of these amazing things to protect God's people. Like, I'm not trying to be Moses. That's like trying to win the Super Bowl after Tom Brady with the Patriots. I'm not doing it. I promise. Joshua had to feel the weight of the leadership. He had to feel at some level like he was sitting in the shade of trees that were planted before him. And he was simply just taking one step after another in the footsteps of Moses, trying to be like Moses, right? And it's the human thing to do. It's what you and I would do. Yet what I love about this passage is it is an affirmation of Joshua as a leader of God's people. Because what starts with Moses is now being ended with Joshua, and there's a finality to that to go, Joshua, you are the person I've asked you to be. Will you step fully in and help the people of Israel see that I am God and I love them and I've been saying these things for years to come? And Joshua steps out from underneath the shade of Moses' leadership, and he begins to lead and own it, and we've watched this happen. And this is the fruition of that, the victory in the northern battle. And I began to wrestle with, okay, so what's that mean for me? Because I think I fall into the role of Joshua at times, where I wait for other people to lead and I follow in their footsteps and I begin to walk and I try to just be like them rather than own my own faith and be the leader in my family and in my life like I know I should. I rather wait for people to tell me what my next step should be rather than run to the Father. And so what if no one's going to force us to lead? What if it's on us to own our faith, step out from the shade of those who have gone before us? What if maybe you don't have anybody? Maybe you don't have anybody in front of you leading you or telling you what you should do next or what it could be like. And you just have to go, hey, can I be honest? No one's told me what it looks like to be a man of God. And I need to figure that out. Would you run to Scripture? Would you run to God to understand who you are, created in His image, so that you can step fully into what He has for you? So often, we wait passively for others to tell us how to lead rather than step in and trust that God has created us to lead right where we are. And this is affirmed in chapter 12. We see, I'm not going to read it to you because if you thought this was bad and a list of names and hard things to say, chapter 12 is literally just a list of 31 kingdoms and kings that have been defeated. The 31 kingdoms that make up the promised land. And they start with conquest by Moses and they end with conquest by Joshua. Again, an affirmation that Joshua is who he's supposed to be. He didn't have to try to be Moses. He just needed to be Joshua. He was able to help them see that there was sin in the camp and help them figure out what it looked like to be faithful and take on the giants 40 years later. That they wouldn't have to run and hide because God the whole time had been saying that they would have a victory. And I'll be honest, like I said, the first time I read this passage, there's a lot of war language, right? There's a lot of killing, there's a lot of bloodshed, and I began to wrestle with like, man, what do you do with that? What does it say about a God who's wiping people out? What do we believe? Where do we fall in this? And so I just began to pray, like, God, what are you trying to say through all this? Help me understand. And through my research, I found a couple of things, and I think it's helpful to understand where we're headed. Because I feel that tension, right? But the first thing is this, that when we hear this war language, when we hear that people were wiped off the face of the earth, that they were destroyed, not a single one was left, it's hyperbole. Here's what that means, right? It's war talk or sports talk for modern day time, right? And there's this moment, like let's say the Celtics and the Lakers are playing and the Lakers absolutely destroy the Celtics, right? They wipe the floor with them. You know what I meant by that. Doesn't mean that they actually took them and wiped the floor with them, right? It means that it was like a blowout game, right? It was an easy victory. And this is what's happening in this passage, right? Like it's this war language, and they want us to understand the gravity and the magnitude of what's happening. But it doesn't mean that there's actually entire nations being wiped off. No, a lot of people died, don't get me wrong. It's war. Battle is being fought. But at the same time, just a couple chapters later, some of these people who were wiped off the face of the earth are mentioned. So we know that they weren't actually wiped off the face of the earth. Like they're talked about these people later in Joshua. And so we know that is happening. The other thing that we need to note is that like in Joshua 2 with Rahab, all of these nations had every opportunity to turn from their wicked ways. And they chose not to. In this last passage section of scripture we read, it said that none of them chose peace. They had an option. and they chose wickedness. And we come to find out that it leads to a hard heart. And I don't want you to miss that, because that little detail is important, right? We hear the same thing about Pharaoh, that his heart grew hard and they sinned against God. They begin to miss the mark. And so don't miss this, that when we live in active sin, our hearts become hardened and we begin to miss the mark. We begin to lose sight of who God has called us to be and the things he says about ourselves. And it becomes really easy to begin to fight for ourselves and shake our fist at God and say, that's not fair, or you don't understand, or you don't get it. It's really easy when we live in sin and don't allow the Spirit in, and we don't confess our sin like Cody gave us the tools and resources to do earlier in the series, to find ourselves shaking our fist at God, putting our head down and moping, rather than trusting that God is going to meet us in the midst of the battle. The last thing, like I said, is that these nations were full of corrupt habits and child sacrifice and all of the corrupt things that you can imagine these nations were plagued with. And God knew that if he allowed it to go undealt with, that these things, these habits, these practices would make their way into the promised land and corrupt the promised land once again. You see, I found myself when I first read this asking myself, like when I heard it, to go like, okay, so if God's just gonna wipe out our enemies, can I like pick up my sword and fight? Can I just take care of myself? And I'm one of God's chosen people, so I'm good. And it sounds silly, but again, like I said earlier, we do this, right? Somebody cuts us off, we go get even. Somebody says something bad about us, we go get even. Somebody gets a job promotion over us, and so we don't give them respect because they don't deserve it as much as we do. And we begin to take the reins and fight for ourselves, and we become really selfish in the face of hurt. And these are the two extremes, right? The short answer is no, God is not calling me to pick up my sword and fight. That's not what we see in this. In fact, he is trying to help us understand that it actually has nothing to do with us in the first place. Like in verse 6, God is fighting a battle that we can't see, that is so much bigger than we ever thought or imagined, and we lose sight of that. You see, when I first read this passage, it was really easy for me to read myself in as one of the Israelites. And the more I studied this, the more I got into it, the more I realized that maybe I have more in common with the Canaanites, those who are full of sin. We see it in the New Testament with the Gentiles, right? I must not forget that I was not born into God's chosen people, that I was adopted through the cross, that you and I, for the most part, were not born into God's chosen people, that we were adopted into the family through the cross and the resurrection. And this passage in this section of scripture reminds us that God is fighting on our behalf, that God is righteous and he will have victory and he will have justice. It may not look the way we want it. It may not feel the way we want it. But hear me, church, in the midst of our injustice, God is fighting a battle that we can't see on our behalf. He has defeated sin through the cross, and we continue to hand over the areas in our life where we feel like we need to fight, the areas in which we are the most painful to hand over, we need to hand over. If anyone understood what it looked like to be faithful in the waiting, it was Israel. They were taken out of Egypt and sent into the promised land and were met by one obstacle after another. It's not fair. That's not how it was supposed to be. That like Israel, you and I will one day be vindicated because it's not our fight, it's God's fight on our behalf. God is fighting a battle that we can't see. And our response is one step of faithfulness after another and inviting God into the battle to fight on our behalf. And one day we will see a victory. This passage goes on to say this in verse 23. I love this because this is how it ends. So Joshua took the entire land just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land rested from war. I love this because, again, it's an affirmation that it is finished, that God has done the thing that he promised he would do through Joshua, and Joshua has delivered as the leader of God's people. The land is being divvied up, and then what we see is that the land rested from war. And this is important because I think in the midst of our battles, sometimes all we long for is rest. And we're going, man, I'm fighting this battle and I don't know where to turn next. It seems so hopeless. It seems helpless and I don't know what to do. I've cried too many tears. I've prayed out. I just don't know where to turn. Friends, there is a time where rest is coming. And whether we see it or not, one day God will find victory in all of these stories and all of these moments. You see, we get caught up fighting an earthly battle, we miss it, right? Ephesians 6 says this: "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." You see, I think we get caught up fighting the wrong battles with the wrong tools, right? We get caught up fighting earthly battles and getting caught in things that don't really matter or have eternal value. And we find ourselves, when those things go wrong, blaming God and being mad at him for our life being so hard and so difficult. Yet it took Israel 40 years to overcome the giants that once stood in their way. Some of you guys have been fighting battles way longer than 40 years. Some of you guys have just started fighting battles and you're getting ready to hold on for 40 years because you will not let go, because you want to get justified. You want to feel like you're vindicated in this. Yet God is looking at us saying, hey, will you let me fight? Will you trust me? Do you believe that I am who I say I am? Because 40 years ago, the giants scared away Israel, and today they claimed victory over those very same giants. Are you hopeless in the midst of the battle? You see, this passage on one hand ends unsure. It's a promise kept, right? We see that God's promise is kept in Scripture, that the promised land is given to Israel, but at the same time, it's an indicator, on the other hand, of the heartache that comes with following God. That it's not easy, that it doesn't always look the way we thought it would, it doesn't always go the way we hoped, but it's worth it. And if we believe that God is who he says he is, then we don't have to fear, because God has already claimed victory through the cross. We're fighting the wrong battles half the time. Yet God looks at us and says, do you trust me to fight on your behalf? How do you do this? What's this look like? You see, it looked like Israel stacking stones and remembering where we came from. And today it's our job to remember the battles that they fought so that we didn't have to learn the same lesson, and we didn't have to go 40 years forgetting that God is who he says he is, but trusting that one step of faithfulness after another leads to a life of faithfulness with God. And that even when it doesn't make sense, God will show up in our lives in ways that we never dreamt possible. So moving forward, here's what I think we need to do. I think we need to ask ourselves 3 questions on a weekly basis, a daily basis, and if not on weekly or daily, then when you find yourselves in the midst of the battle, will you ask yourself these 3 questions? And I promise you, you'll find yourself running to the Father. The first one is this: who has God created me to be? You see, I think we doubt our abilities and the ways in which God created us, and we begin to look at others and go, well, if I could just be more like, or if I just had more of, fill in the blank. And we compare ourselves to what others have or what we do or don't have, and we find ourselves miserable and afraid to step into the call that God has on our lives because we don't feel like we have what it takes. Yet God didn't call Joshua to be Moses. He called Joshua to be Joshua. And Joshua led his people into the promised land. Maybe for the first time in your life, you need to say, God, I don't know who I am. Who have you created me to be? Would you come into my life? Would you come into my heart and begin to teach me who I am in the midst of my brokenness? Here's an interesting thing. I was talking with a friend the other day about how he found God. I said, hey, how did you find God? Like, what did that look like for you? He said, Connor, you know what's funny is I didn't find God in the church. I didn't find God at all, really. He found me in the darkest, worst moment of my life. And he loved me right there in that moment. And that was when my life changed. That's my story. I didn't grow up in church. I didn't experience God in a church setting. I experienced God in the lowest, darkest moments of college. And he began to teach me who I am and that he had more for my life. And if it wouldn't have been for me to quiet and listen to his voice, I would have never been here today. The second thing we need to ask is, what battle am I fighting? You see, we see in 2 Timothy that the author encourages us, don't get caught up in useless chatter. And I think we do this, right? We get caught up fighting over things that don't really matter, but feel like they're a part of our heart. They feel like a part of who we are. It's why I get in these rage fights with people on Facebook Messenger that I don't even know over things that I don't really care all that much about. We're fighting earthly battles. We get caught up fighting for things that really don't matter or have eternal value. And in the process, we miss out on our neighbor who's hurting and struggling with the loss of their spouse, with that cancer diagnosis, with a tough decision on whether or not they're going to move forward with work or a treatment or whatever it might be. We miss out on those opportunities when we get clouded with earthly battles. So ask yourself, what battle am I fighting? And the third thing is this. What does it look like for me to surrender to God daily? This is where we invite God into the battle, right? Guys, we can't do it alone. We need God to show up in a mighty way. And here in a moment, we're going to go into a time of prayer. And I want to encourage you to think about these 3 questions and to begin to wrestle with, what does it look like for me to surrender those things that I've been white knuckle holding on to for the last 10 years? And when I finally step out in victory over those giants and allow God to be the one to claim victory. In the Old Testament, it looked like a battle. And in the New Testament, it looks like a cross. Would you surrender at the foot of the cross this morning? And if it's your first time here, would you just be quiet and listen and process? And if you're a believer, it's a great time for you to take communion and remember all that God did through the cross and finding victory in our lives. Let's pray. God, I come before you and I ask, Lord, that you would do immeasurably more today than we could ever ask or imagine. God, that you would receive honor, and God, that we would submit our lives to you. God, that we would surrender all that we have for you. God, that we would get out of our own way, that we would stop fighting earthly battles, and God, that we would ask for you to join us in the midst of the darkest moments. God, we see in Israel's story that you do this for them, and God, you tell us that you want to do this for us. Yet, God, oftentimes we miss it because we're distracted. God, I pray, Lord, that we would be distraction-free this morning and you would reveal to us the ways in which we need to surrender. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.